Hello and welcome back to the Movie Memo Recaps. Today we are going to recap a 2013 movie titled Assault on Wall Street. Please be advised that there will be spoilers ahead. The movie opens in a major corporation that invests in stocks, led by Jeremy. At the time, Jeremy decided to deceive his two managers and direct his employees to get as many clients as possible. Once they had collected all the clients' money, they would stage a scenario in which the stock market fell, despite their usual control over the stock market. Initially, one of the managers protested to Jeremy, asking what would happen to their clients' pensions. However, Jeremy no longer cared, as his primary focus was on maximizing profits. Following that, Jeremy's two managers instructed all of their staff to approach existing or new clients about investing in their company. We are then introduced to Jim escorting his wife, Rosie, to have her head tumor examined. At the time, the doctor told Rosie that the tumor in her skull had vanished, but she still needed weekly exams to keep it from returning. Rosie also had to have hormone injections. When Rosie arrived home, she appeared frustrated and felt like her life was a burden to Jim, as their family had accumulated a significant amount of debt following her illness 5 years earlier. Knowing this, Jim attempted to calm Rosie down by assuring her that everything would be fine and that he would remain enthusiastic at work so that their financial situation would improve soon. The next day, Jim went to work as a security guard, escorting an armored truck loaded with money sent to every central bank. Jim then vented his frustrations to a buddy named Sean, who tried to console him by telling him that everything he was going through would pass. During their break, they met with two police officers who were also pals, Frank and Freddie. They were also protesting about their economic situation at the time, especially since the government had abruptly reduced their pay and pensions. Frank claimed that he had arrested scores of thieves, but the true robbers were the officials. Frank argued that they should imprison those officials and replace them with trustworthy ones. However, Freddie questioned whether there were still honest officials nowadays. A week later, Rosie continued visiting the doctor for a routine checkup and hormone injection. Jim always paid for the examinations using a credit card, which he had to pay off every month because the firm where he worked refused to help with his wife's insurance. Unexpectedly, Jim had invested his savings in a stock trading company, oblivious to the company's attempts to defraud its clients. Jim panicked when he saw the value of the shares he purchased drop. The next day, Jim met one of Jeremy's employees, Robert, who had always promised him returns and guaranteed all of his investment funds. Growing distrustful, Jim asked Robert to withdraw and repay his money before the shares completely vanished. However, Robert replied that he could not take the investment money until the agreed upon time. Robert also told Jim that the company's stock would climb again within a few weeks. Despite this, Jim insisted that Robert refund his money immediately, but Robert left without a clear answer. That night, Jim observed a further decline in his shares and came to the conclusion that he was a victim of fraud. As a result, Jim immediately reached out to Robert, declaring that he would sue Robert's company in court due to its obvious fraud. The following day, Jim visited a lawyer named Patterson to resolve his legal complaint. Patterson was eager to assist Jim in any way he could after hearing about his issues. Patterson even claimed that he could easily address such situations. However, before beginning his work, Patterson requested that Jim pay for his services up front. But when Patterson discovered Jim didn't have the money, he instructed him to leave and return when he did. The next day, during lunch, Jim's three buddies inquired as to why he appeared so sad. Jim claimed that he needed the money to pay his lawyer and sue the phony investment organization. However, his three buddies were all struggling financially and couldn't do much to help. After Frank and Freddie left, Sean abruptly stated that he had savings and would lend them to Jim. Initially, Jim refused because he was hesitant to borrow from Sean. However, Sean insisted, and Jim eventually consented to accept the money. A while later, Jim returned to Patterson and handed him the money he had demanded. With his friend's savings, Jim believed Patterson could help him quickly retrieve his investment funds from Robert. Later, Rosie resumed her routine checks and hormone injections. When Jim arrived home, Rosie noticed that her husband was carrying a significant burden. As time passed, their family situation deteriorated. Now, Jim was forced to borrow money from several sources just to feed his family. One day, Rosie refused to go to the doctor because she knew Jim couldn't afford it, and she showed him his rising bank bills. One of the institutions Jim had borrowed from was threatening to seize their home soon. When Jim discovered this, he attempted to call Patterson, whom he had paid well, but he had been unavailable for quite some time. When he finally managed to reach Patterson, he casually asserted that Jim's case was illegal due to the legal protection of the corporation where Robert worked. Rosie, who also heard the news, immediately blamed herself, believing her life was a burden to Jim. However, Jim tried to reassure Rosie that everything would be fine. Jim hastily went to work since he couldn't face seeing his wife cry. Upon arriving at work, Jim faced further misfortune when his employer abruptly dismissed him after receiving numerous calls from the corporations that Jim had borrowed from. Jim pondered over his past actions that led to his dismissal. However, Jim's supervisor brought up his significant debt and expressed concern that it could potentially hinder his performance. After his dismissal, Jim confidently went to the Labor Department office, asserting that his removal should not have been unilateral. Unfortunately, after a long wait, the official's aide drove him away, claiming that the official was out of town. Jim was upset because the Labor Department representative was present in the office. Ultimately, the assistant revealed that the official disliked interruptions, particularly from impoverished individuals. Meanwhile, Rosie, constantly blaming herself, took a drastic step to alleviate Jim's burden. In summary, upon Jim's arrival home, he found his wedding ring next to a note from Rosie. Jim immediately hurried upstairs to check on Rosie, only to discover that she was already dead. The loss of Rosie devastated Jim. Jim couldn't keep back his tears during Rosie's burial, which marked a watershed moment in his quest for justice. Jim consumed alcohol every day, feeling his life completely ruined. He also ignored calls from his 3 buddies who wanted to check on him. One night, while walking aimlessly, Jim noticed a Labor Department official partying with wealthy individuals. Shortly afterwards, the official went outside to take a phone call. Jim approached the official and inquired why he did not support the needy. Unexpectedly, the official arrogantly said that he couldn't work for poor people. Reflexively, Jim pushed the official, which resulted in a cab striking and killing him. When Jim saw this, he rushed down a desolate street. The Labor Department official's death received widespread coverage across numerous media outlets. Fortunately, the police treated it as a typical accident. As a result, Jim vowed to bring down the officials responsible for corrupting the country's financial system. His strategy began with a visit to a newspaper kiosk in search of information on the masterminds responsible for the system's corruption. The next day, Jim faced further misfortune when bank personnel showed up, alerting him to the imminent repossession of his house within 24 hours. Jim quickly packed all of his important items, including the sniper weapon he had hidden all along. Jim then decided to use the remainder of his money to relocate into a cheap apartment. Jim then got a call from Sean and his 2 police colleagues. Jim eventually answered the phone, and they conveyed their extreme concern for him, as he had not returned any calls since his wife died. They invited Jim to meet in their normal canteen. However, Jim was preparing for a significant event and expressed his need for some alone time. Not long later, Jim went to see an illegal gun dealer. Jim spent the remainder of his money on weaponry to carry out his plan. Jim also made sure to buy grenades from the arms dealer. After that, Jim went to a remote location to practice his shooting. After completing his preparations, Jim covertly waited for a target in a parking lot. When the target arrived, Jim quickly eliminated him. The individual turned out to be the vice president of a well-known stock business. This led to the media announcing the official's death, but the police struggled to find the gunman as Jim left no traces. Jim's next plot was to murder a finance minister. He stated that the minister should be held accountable for the instability of the capitalist system. Throughout his activity, Jim surreptitiously monitored the minister's house from a distance, and when the opportunity arose, Jim fired his sniper. Following the episode, the police and many media outlets promptly reported on the horror. They determined that financial officials should exercise caution since it appeared that someone was out to harm them. That night, Jim took action again, this time eliminating an official in charge of all of the United States central banks. Furthermore, Jim was aware that this individual had a history of implementing policies that caused human suffering. 2 days later, Jeremy, the head of the fictitious investment organization, became alarmed after hearing multiple reports about the deaths of financial officials. Jeremy, thinking he would be next, instantly instructed his staff to recruit a burly bodyguard to protect him. At the same time, Jim decided to meet his 3 pals at their normal canteen. Jim smiled for the first time after hearing his friends' jokes. They also discussed the latest terror attacks on financial sector personnel. Upon hearing this, Jim confessed that he was responsible for their murders and even had plans to assassinate the officials of the fraudulent investment company that had deceived him. As a result, his 3 buddies chuckled, assuming Jim's statements were a joke. The next day, Jim disguised himself as a janitor at Jeremy's investing firm. Jim did this to better comprehend the layout of the structure. Jim visited Jeremy's office daily until he became familiar with every room. One day, while strolling outside, Jim ran across Robert, the man who had previously fooled him. Robert shamelessly pitched Jim another investment opportunity and even gave him a new business card. That night, Jim contacted Robert, pretending to want to reinvest his money and claiming to have won the lottery. Hearing this, Robert quickly invited Jim to meet him at the office the next day and reminded him to bring his money. After contacting Robert, Jim went to a remote location to practice shooting, feeling his aim improving. Not long later, Jim went to an empty building immediately opposite from Jeremy's office and prepared his ammunition to take them out. At the same time, Robert approached the office, and Jim shot him. After shooting Robert, Jim proceeded to shoot all of Jeremy's staff members, who had been deceiving people all along. Jim set fire to his sniper rifle at the scene to conceal his actions. Jim hurried down and entered Jeremy's office through the back door. This time, Jim used a mask to carry out his actions. Jim immediately eliminated all of Jeremy's remaining staff once he arrived upstairs. He even detonated 6 grenades that he had previously obtained from an illegal arms dealer. After finishing them off, Jim headed to the top floor to meet Jeremy. During the process, one of Jeremy's guards shot Jim on the hand, but Jim was able to kill him. At the same time, down below, the cops had just arrived and were securing each office room individually. Meanwhile, Jim confronted Jeremy, who was now alone. Jim immediately removed his disguise and questioned why Jeremy was so cruel in deceiving the people for his own benefit. Without feeling guilty, Jeremy asserted that all authorities engaged in unscrupulous activities to amass substantial wealth. Perhaps only 1 out of 1,000 officials acted honestly, as they couldn't become wealthy without deceiving customers or clients. At the same time, Jim noticed the police nearing the top floor. Therefore, he challenged Jeremy to a duel. Whoever was the fastest to grasp the weapon would live. However, just as Jim was setting the weapon down, Jeremy grabbed it and intended to shoot him. At that moment, the police entered the room and fired shots at Jeremy, who was still holding the firearm. Jim's well-planned strategy led the police to believe Jeremy had committed the murder. The cops, believing Jim was a victim, rushed him downstairs for medical assistance. Upon apprehending Jim, his 2 police colleagues concluded that his remarks at the canteen were accurate. However, they refused to betray him due to the legal protection of the thieves he had slain. Jim then left the scene, having eliminated all of the corrupt financial officials. Following that, he swore to take on corrupt lawyers, judges, and other dirty officials in the legal profession. Thanks for watching. If you are new, don't forget to subscribe for more of these recaps. Until next time, have a nice day.